I still remember standing at my wife's funeral, reaching for words, when my own son cut me off and said, "Don't speak, Dad. It's better for the family this way." That day, they banned me from every gathering, every memory, as if I never existed. The silence nearly broke me, but in that silence, I began preparing, recording every lie, every theft, every betrayal. So when they finally showed up at the gates of my new mansion, demanding everything I had left, I was ready. They thought they had erased me, but I had been waiting for this moment all along. Follow my story until the end, and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. The day of Marjorie's funeral should have been about honoring her life, but the silence that surrounded me carried a weight heavier than grief. Standing among black coats and bowed heads in the Asheville chapel, every breath tasted of sorrow and rejection. Darian's eyes met mine only once, cold, sharp, and final, before I could even whisper a word of remembrance for the woman I had spent my entire life beside. His voice cut through the hush. "Don't. Not here." That short command stripped me of the right to mourn my wife in front of my own family. The words landed like stones, and I lowered my head, swallowing a storm that no one would ever see. From the corner of my eye, I noticed how carefully the others avoided me. Not a single hand reached out. No one leaned in to share a quiet condolence. Lorraine's grip on Alara's shoulder tightened whenever the girl glanced toward me, as if my presence were poison. Alara's eyes pleaded, but Lorraine steered her away with a subtle tug, severing even that fragile chance at comfort. That small rejection, more than the crowd's indifference, drove the truth home. I was being cast out. The quiet of the room seemed to echo louder than the pastor's prayers, filling me with unease that pressed deeper than sorrow. When the service ended, Darian approached, his face set like stone. The words he chose weren't loud, but they carved into me more sharply than any scream could have. "It's best for the family's image if you keep your distance," he said. "You're not welcome at gatherings anymore." No anger in his voice, just the chilling calm of a decision already sealed. Betrayal wrapped itself around my chest, and though every part of me wanted to fight back, to shout at the boy I had raised, I held on to the last scrap of dignity I had left. Silence became my only defense. Driving back to my modest house that night, memories flooded me in waves. Nights spent awake beside Marjorie when bills stacked too high, mornings working extra shifts so Darian could attend college without debt. Sacrifices piled one on top of another until there was nothing left of me but a man who had given it all. And now, standing in the wreckage of what used to be family, I thought of how easily decades of devotion had been dismissed. The house smelled of her perfume, faint but piercing, and every corner reminded me of what I had lost. I sat alone at the kitchen table, the dim light flickering against the walls. The voices from earlier still lingered, sharp and unyielding, replaying in my mind like an unbroken record. No footsteps came down the hallway, no phone rang, just the hum of silence filling every corner. The ban wasn't just words, it was exile. Solitude pressed against me with a weight I hadn't known before, heavier even than grief itself. In that quiet, something inside me began to shift. Days passed, and not a single call, not a single knock at the door came. The banishment stretched from hours into weeks, an unspoken decree written into every empty evening. I sat by the window one night, Marjorie's photo in my hand, her smile frozen forever in a frame. My voice cracked as I whispered, "They've cut me off, Marjorie. I've been erased from my own family." The realization settled like a final shovelful of dirt over a grave. The silence wasn't temporary, it was permanent. The silence that had wrapped around me after Marjorie's funeral stretched on like a shadow that refused to leave. Days bled into weeks. And though I tried to distract myself with the ordinary rhythms of life, making coffee in the morning, sitting by the window at dusk, there was no escaping the ache of being cast out. One evening, desperate for some kind of connection, I turned to the family's social media pages. At first, the photos brought a bittersweet comfort, familiar smiles, holidays, birthdays, but then I saw something that stopped my breath, my face, once there, was gone. In a picture of Marjorie's last birthday, I remembered standing in the center, holding her hand as everyone sang. Yet in the photo before me, there was only a gap, neatly filled by a blurred backdrop. I blinked, certain it was a trick of the screen, but the truth sat cold before me. I had not simply been pushed aside, I had been erased. The realization settled in like a knife between my ribs. Someone, likely Darian or Lorraine, had gone through each photograph and scrubbed me away. It was not neglect or accident, it was deliberate, meticulous. They were rewriting the story of our family as if I had never existed. Watching my own memories dissolve into nothing was worse than being shunned at the funeral. Presents could be ignored. But history was meant to be permanent. I stared longer at that birthday photo, remembering the glow of candles and the way Marjorie's eyes shimmered with gratitude. I had leaned over to kiss her cheek that night, proud of the years we had weathered together. Now, it was as if I had never stood by her side. They had reduced me to a ghost, unworthy of being remembered. The pain deepened, stretching into something raw and bitter. I shut the laptop, but the image of that hollowed-out space where I once stood kept replaying in my mind. Then came another blow, carried by a passing neighbor's careless remark. Darian had sold the old family home, the house I had built with my own hands, brick by brick, board by board. I had poured my life into those walls, sleepless nights fixing the roof, patching the plumbing, stretching every paycheck to cover the mortgage. That home was more than shelter. It was proof of every sacrifice Marjorie and I had made for our children. And now it was gone, traded away like a disposable trinket. I walked past it one last time, unable to resist the pull. A new family was already moving in, boxes stacked on the porch. The oak tree still stood tall in the yard, the same one Alara used to climb when she was little, giggling from the branches. The swing I'd tied to its limbs still swayed in the breeze. Marjorie's chair had once sat on that porch, where she'd hum old tunes as the sun dipped low. Every corner whispered my history, yet none of it belonged to me anymore. "They've stolen my history," I muttered under my breath. "But not my soul." The words came sharp, steady, and to my own surprise, they steadied me. For the first time since the funeral, a flicker of defiance stirred in my chest. The pattern was clear now. They weren't just pushing me out of gatherings. They were cutting away everything that proved I had ever mattered. Photos, home, legacy. Each act was a chisel against the foundation of my life. And yet, in their cruelty, they awakened something they hadn't expected. I began to feel sharper, harder, weakened in some ways, yes, but also tempered like steel under fire. The final strike came when I overheard Darian boasting at a community event. He told anyone who would listen that he had bought and paid for that family house, presenting it as his gift to the family's future. The lie made my blood surge hot, fists clenching tight at my sides. I wanted to shout the truth, to strip away his falsehood in front of everyone, but I held my tongue. The silence I carried was no longer the silence of defeat. It was the silence of a man waiting, sharpening his resolve. When Darian claimed the house was his gift to the family, I whispered to myself that night, "One day, the truth will rise." And so began the long years where I lived in shadows, counting the cost of their betrayal. The years that followed felt like walking through a fog that never lifted. Days blended together, and silence filled every corner of the house. Breakfasts were quiet affairs, coffee cooling in the cup before a single sip. The porch that once rang with Marjorie's laughter now sat in stillness, boards creaking only under my own weight. Even the garden seemed to wither, as though it too had been abandoned. What stung most was not the solitude itself, but the way neighbors I had known for decades began to drift away, their glances sharp but fleeting, their greetings swallowed before they reached me. At first, I thought it was coincidence when Bill, a friend of mine from church, crossed the street instead of walking past my house. But then it happened again, and again. Men I had worked beside on community projects suddenly found pressing business elsewhere whenever our paths might have met. It didn't take much imagination to guess where this sudden chill came from. Darian's voice was strong in their ears. Carrying stories meant to diminish me. Betrayal was no longer confined to my family. It seeped into the sidewalks, the stores, the Sunday pews. The sting of being treated like a stranger in my own town cut deeper than any words Darian had spoken at the funeral. The worst wound, however, was inflicted in whispers. Lorraine, with her polished smile and steady gaze, spread seeds of doubt wherever she went. At the market, I caught fragments of her handiwork. Unstable, bitter, not safe to be around. Words not spoken to me directly, but spoken loudly enough to pierce. I held my tongue, though my chest burned. To confront them would be to prove her lies right. So I bore it, one quiet humiliation at a time, while inside a storm gathered, demanding release. Marjorie's memory became my compass. Her voice, faint but steady, seemed to remind me silence can be strength. I replayed her counsel in my mind when anger rose, choosing to let the fire smolder instead of blaze. Exile, I realized, was not only punishment, it was training. Patience grew in me like a muscle tested daily. I learned to see through the masks of those who avoided me, to recognize fear where once there had been friendship. If nothing else, I was becoming sharper, tempered by the flame of abandonment. At night, when the weight of solitude pressed hardest, a single thought gave me relief: Alara. Her laughter still echoed in memory, bright and untarnished. I pictured her climbing the oak tree in the old yard, or pressing her small hand into mine. That hope, that she had not forgotten me, became the anchor that held me steady. Even if the world turned its back, she remained the reason to endure. The possibility of her still remembering her grandfather was enough to keep the ember of resilience alive. Then came the note, slipped under my door one damp evening, folded and silent, carrying no name. The words were brief, written in a hand I did not recognize. You'll regret staying silent. The chill it sent through me was not of fear, but of confirmation. Someone was watching. Someone wanted to break me further. Holding that paper, I understood. Exile was no longer just silence, it was a warning, a shadow of storms yet to come. The next morning, I walked out onto the porch, scanning the street, certain someone had been watching me all along. The note lay on the kitchen table behind me, folded with the kind of care reserved for a knife slid back into its sheath. A thin veil of fog clung to Asheville's hills, the maples along the block already shedding rust-red leaves that skittered across the pavement like small, nervous animals. A jogger passed without meeting my eye. A delivery truck idled 2 houses down longer than it needed to. A feeling settled in the bones. Betrayal had grown darker than silence. It had learned to hide. Coffee cooled in my hand while the neighborhood performed its polite avoidance. Curtains stirred and stilled. A mailbox lid clanged. Then nothing. The note's 6 words kept circling. You'll regret staying silent. It wasn't the threat that hooked under the ribs. It was the knowledge that someone believed the lie so fully they no longer cared to be seen. The air felt crowded with eyes, and yet the street looked empty. Autumn had sharpened everything. The smell of wet leaves, the creak of old boards, the line between fear and resolve. Groceries couldn't wait, and hunger was the one honest thing left. So I drove to the market on Merriman. As soon as the door chimed, whispers moved like a cold draft. The butcher, usually quick with a joke, kept trimming his cut, refusing to look up. 2 women near the apples fell silent mid-sentence. At the register, the young clerk hesitated over my bread as if it carried a warning label. Someone behind me said, just loud enough, "Unstable old men should keep to themselves." For a breath, heat rose to the throat. Then the voice of habit wanted to fade, to shrink. Not today. "Son," I said to the clerk, voice steady, "you ring up the bread and the coffee just like you would for any neighbor. I've paid taxes in this town longer than you've been alive. You'll treat me with respect." A few heads turned. The clerk blinked, swallowed, and started scanning. The receipt printed with a mechanical sigh, and something in the room shifted, maybe not in my favor, but no longer entirely against me. I left without stomping or storming, the small plastic bag swinging at my side like a flag that refused to touch the ground. And back home, the note waited. No signature, clean edges, paper bought in any store. Lorraine's touch lived in the tone, rattle him, make him flinch, feed the rumor that he's brittle. She was always precise with appearances, gifted at planting doubts that grew all on their own. Instead of fear, a different current hummed. Time to prepare. I sat at the old desk Marjorie loved, pulled a legal pad close, and began outlining truths, dates, bank transfers, tuition checks, the contractor's receipts from the house Darian claimed as his gift. Not a manifesto, just facts that could stand without me. Silence was no longer a retreat. It became staging. The light shifted on the floorboards, the room filling with the warm, amber hush of late afternoon. A memory entered like a breath of pine, Marjorie in the kitchen, flour on her knuckles, telling me, a man's silence is not weakness, it is the preparation for the right strike. She had meant it for a business dispute years ago, but wisdom keeps its passport up to date. Her voice steadied the hands. The pen moved slower, writing fewer words and better ones. When anger knocked, it met the deadbolt of discipline. There would be no shouting match, no scene. They had written that script for me already. I would not act in their play. Near dusk. The phone rang. Darian's name flashed on the screen for the first time in years. The room went very still. He didn't waste time on greetings. You should stop stirring trouble, Dad. People are talking. The old habit of pleading tried to lift its head, but it died on the doorstep. The truth has a way of talking louder than lies, I said, even unhurried. A pause crackled down the line. He exhaled. Sharp. This will only make things worse. For whom? Another pause, shorter, then the click. The call ended, leaving a faint tone and the feeling of a door closing in a different house, far away. Outside, a thin rain began, tapping the gutters with patient fingers. I walked the fence line before dark, the way a man checks windows before sleep when the weather shifts. Near the back gate, the soil had gone to mud. That's where the impressions showed, clear, recent, not mine, deep enough to mean wait, turned at an angle as though the visitor had listened, then looked back over a shoulder. A cold, clean certainty settled in. This wasn't just rumor anymore. Someone wanted me to feel the breath on my neck. Back inside, the house held the quiet like a church at night. The note rested under a magnet on the fridge, no longer a taunt, now a reminder. The legal pad lay open on the desk, ink still drying. The old clock in the hallway ticked, sure as a heart that had decided not to hurry. The line between fear and readiness disappeared. Some fights don't ask for your consent. They simply arrive. I turned off lights room by room, not to hide, but to see better what moved outside. At the bedroom door, I looked out once more at the yard where the prints waited to be washed away by rain. The note wasn't a threat, it was a promise, and the footprints proved I was already living inside their shadow. Morning broke with a cleaner edge than the nights that had come before it. Sleep hadn't done much, but resolve had. There's a steadiness that settles in when a man has decided he will not be chased from his own porch. Coffee steamed on the railing while the fog lifted off the blue ridge like breath leaving a tired animal. The footprints near the fence had faded under rain, but the idea behind them remained. Enough watching, enough being watched. The day would not pass with me pretending I hadn't noticed the shadow at my heel, so I tidied the small yard, trimmed a stubborn strand of boxwood, and left the front gate latched, not to keep anyone out, but to make them unlatch it if they chose to walk in. By noon, the sky cleared to a pale, brittle blue. That's when the black SUV rolled to the curb, paint shining like a sermon about success. Darian stepped out first, smooth as a man arriving for a photo op. Lorraine followed, phone in hand, smile preloaded with sympathy that arrived a beat too early. You shouldn't isolate yourself like this, Dad, Darian said, letting his gaze slide across the porch as if it needed approval. It worries people. Lorraine nodded, eyes mapping the woodwork, the curtains, the house's smallness. as if she needed proof the exile had worked. Their shoes clicked up the walk. The latch lifted. I didn't invite them in. They didn't wait to be asked. For a moment, we stood in a triangle of quiet, wind moving the chimes from Marjorie's old garden, the faint scent of rosemary and cut grass refusing to leave the room to them. Lorraine broke first. "We heard you've been tense." The pause was deliberate. "And there were some misunderstandings at the market. You know how people talk." Darian made a sound between a chuckle and a sigh, a practiced fatherly noise he wore now like a borrowed coat. "We can help you, but you have to meet us halfway," he said. "Sell this place, move into assisted living where they keep an eye on things. It's safer, for everyone." The words were offered as a blanket. The chill underneath them belonged to something else entirely. "You came to help," I said, keeping the voice level. "By arriving without warning to a house you say I shouldn't live in." Darian rolled his shoulders, rehearsed ease slipping. "You're not listening. There are concerns. People think you're spiraling. We can manage your accounts. Make sure you don't get taken advantage of." Lorraine smiled again, smaller now. "If you sign a few papers, we can streamline your care, less to worry about. A long time ago, that tone had talked me into paying for new tires at midnight so they could make a trip to the beach. Back then, it sounded like family. Today, it sounded like a lock clicking shut. Spiraling? The word tasted like rust. Because I buy bread and look people in the eye? Because I mow my own grass? Darian shrugged. Because you stir trouble. The past is past. Dad, let it lie. He moved closer, lowering his voice to the register he used when he wanted his words to feel like a hand on the shoulder. You've been forgetful. We all are sometimes at your age. Age. The same age that paid for his schooling, for the down payment he once called a miracle, for the rehab on a house he now claimed as a personal triumph. Lorraine slid a folder from her bag, tapping it against her palm. "This is standard paperwork," she said, as though I had asked. The porch carried sounds in strange ways. Every syllable seemed to travel farther than it should. "Say it plain," I said. "You want control of what remains so you can sleep at night." Darian's smile thinned. "We want to prevent you from making mistakes you can't afford." "Like trusting you?" The quiet after that sentence belonged to a different afternoon. Lorraine's lips parted, then closed. Darian's jaw worked, the way his grandfather's had worked when a deal soured at the last minute. "This is the last time we're asking nicely," he said. "Sign, and we'll handle everything." Something rose like a tide and then settled. Years of being kept outside my own history had burned away the flammable parts of pride. What stayed was harder, cleaner. "I built what you now squander," I said. Not loud, not slow, but final. Don't mistake my silence for weakness. The line did not crack. It landed and stayed. Darian blinked, color shifting under his skin. Lorraine's smile lost its scaffolding. The folder in her hand lowered a fraction, as if the paper had gained weight. For the first time in a long while, the porch felt like my porch again. It didn't last. Nothing honest ever does when people come to win. Lorraine drew herself up, practical sweetness returning like makeup reapplied. "Think carefully," she said, voice light as glass, "or you'll regret making enemies of your own blood." Darian exhaled through his nose, eyes fixed on a point just over my shoulder, as if looking into a camera only he could see. "We tried," he told the air. "No one can say we didn't." They stepped back. The latch fell, and the SUV swallowed them whole. The street returned to its small noises, a dog collar jingling, a screen door somewhere, the soft insistence of wind. Shaking didn't announce itself with drama. It arrived in the elbows, in the small muscles of the hands. Rage wants a show. Dignity wants a chair and time. I sat, breathed, and counted backward the way Marjorie once taught Alara before exams, 10 to 1. With each number, another brick clicked into place in a wall that would not be pushed. The sentence I'd spoken kept ringing, not like a bell, but like a steel bar taking its first weight without bending. It wasn't triumph, it was alignment. What I believed and what I said had finally met in daylight. Dusk gathered early. Blue light leaning into the windows. The street thinned to silhouettes. A single car rolled past, not slowing. I made tea, wrote down the date, and the short version of the conversation: who came, what they asked, what I answered. Paper doesn't forget. Somewhere between the second and third page, a thud hit the front of the house. Not a knock, something dull and low. I walked out with the porch light off, letting the night stay honest. The mailbox hung open, jaw pried wide. Envelopes lay scattered in the damp leaves. Some split, contents peeking out like ribs. Kneeling made the knees complain, but the hands learned a new calm, gathering edges, brushing dirt. Among junk flyers and a utility bill lay pieces of a letter from the bank, another from the lawyer who'd handled a tenant dispute years back. Torn not by accident, rifled. The gate latch was down again, though I hadn't touched it since they left. Down the block, a porch light flickered on, then off. Somewhere, a screen door clicked. The wind sharpened. Peaceful men tell themselves stories to avoid the obvious. The evening handed me the obvious and waited to see what I would do with it. I stacked the envelopes, felt the grit of soil against the paper, and stood very still. Fear is a loud thing at first. Then it learns the cadence of your breath and tries to match it. Let it try. I went inside, laid the broken letters under a lamp, and stared long enough to feel the first clean edge of anger turn into purpose. Locks would change. Cameras would go up. And tomorrow I would carry these torn mouths of paper to someone who could read what they meant. The war had stopped asking for permission to enter. When I picked up the torn envelopes from the dirt, I knew the war had just stepped across my threshold. The dirt still clung to my hands that night as I carried the torn envelopes inside. Most were harmless, utility bills, a catalog I never asked for, but one was missing, the latest bank statement. I had seen its edge among the scattered pile. But now it was gone. My heart thudded in my chest as realization sank in. This wasn't a prank. Someone had rifled through my life, carefully plucking the one piece of paper that mattered most. For a long while, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the jagged edges of the ripped envelopes. Marjorie's old clock ticked on the wall, each beat pounding the thought deeper. They had crossed the line. Darian's veiled words echoed, "Think carefully, or you'll regret making enemies of your own blood." The missing statement was no accident. Fear knotted my stomach, but beneath it, something else stirred. Vigilance. The next morning, I locked what was left of my papers in the old steel box Marjorie once used for keepsakes. As I turned the key, a bitter laugh escaped. What good was a lock when the thieves were my own blood? The thought left a sour taste in my mouth. Every creak of the floorboards felt like a warning. Every shadow near the window seemed to linger longer than it should. By midday, I knew I couldn't keep this to myself. Gideon Maris had always been steady, too honest to buy into Darian's whispers, too stubborn to be swayed by gossip. I carried the battered stack to his home, the cold air burning my lungs as if daring me to admit my weakness. Gideon's brow furrowed the moment he saw the torn letters. He spread them across his table with care, eyes sharp. "You can't ignore this, Eldrick," he said firmly. "This isn't just family drama anymore. It's tampering. You need a lawyer." Shame clawed at me. A man of 70, sitting at another's table with his dignity in tatters, afraid of his own children. To drag this into a courtroom felt like tearing open a wound for the whole town to see. "They've already painted me as unstable," I muttered. "If I take this public, it will only feed their story." Gideon's jaw tightened. "Then don't face it alone. I know someone, Silas Drayton, discreet. He knows how to trace these things without a parade." His voice softened, but his eyes held mine. "Let him help. Don't let their lies bury you alive." I hesitated, then nodded. Silence had been my armor, but now it felt like a coffin. If Darian and Lorraine wanted to strip me of everything, I would not hand it to them willingly. Marjorie's words came back, quiet but unyielding. "Keep your eyes open, even for those you love most." That night, as I stared at the papers on my kitchen table, the resolve in me hardened. This fight was no longer about comfort. It was about truth, about justice. They could erase my image from photos, sell the house I built, twist the town against me, but I would not surrender the truth. The phone rang just as the house sank into silence. The number was unfamiliar. Against my better judgment, I answered. A low voice hissed through the line. "Stop digging, or next time it won't be just letters you lose." The dial tone followed, leaving the words echoing in the hollow quiet. My hands shook, not from age this time, but from the cold realization this wasn't a quarrel anymore. It was a war, and it had turned dangerous. The phone call from the night before wouldn't leave my mind. That voice, low and deliberate, repeated itself over and over as I sat in the dim light of my kitchen. It wasn't just a warning, it was a promise. By dawn, I had barely slept, and when I stepped outside for some air, the chill of early winter bit into my bones. Across the street, Mrs. Halbrook, who had once traded pies with Marjorie, saw me and quickly crossed to the other side, keeping her eyes down. The distance stung. It wasn't just family now. My neighbors, the people I had known for decades, were treating me like a shadow. Walking into town later that day, I forced myself to steady my nerves. At the bank, I thought I could at least put some order into my accounts, but the young teller glanced at her screen, then at me with a mixture of pity and suspicion. "Mr. Vaughn," she said carefully, "we already have the power of attorney forms here. Your son Darian filed them last week." My hand trembled against the counter. I never signed anything. She spoke to me as though I might be confused. Her voice slowed down as if to a child. Shame flared hot across my face, and I clenched my jaw to keep from shouting. On my way home, I passed the iron gates of the old mansion. Lorraine stood there, waiting as if she had known I would come by. Her smile was sharp, the kind meant to wound. "Eldrick," she said sweetly, "you really should rest more. You're not yourself lately." Every word dripped with venom masked as care. I bit down on the rage burning in my chest, meeting her gaze without a word. She wanted me to break, to lash out so her story would spread faster. I walked away, her smirk echoing behind me louder than any insult. Later that afternoon, Gideon stopped by with a look that was meant to comfort but couldn't quite hide the worry in his eyes. I told him about the bank, about Lorraine's insinuations. He put a hand on my shoulder and said, "Let Silas handle this. He's already tracing the documents. We'll get to the bottom of it." I nodded, but in the silence between us I caught a flicker of doubt. Was he, too, starting to wonder if I was losing my grip? Even the trust of an old friend felt fragile. The weight of it pressed on me until the walls of my house seemed too small to hold it. That night, I sat on the porch listening to the wind move through the bare trees. Voices drifted from the sidewalk. "He's lost his mind," one neighbor whispered. "Darian's just trying to take care of him." My chest tightened as if a hand had wrapped around it. The lies weren't just words anymore. They were taking root in the people around me. A man who had once fixed their fences, who had shared drinks with them after long days' work, was now painted as unstable, unfit. The loneliness cut deeper than exile itself. It was a burial in plain sight. When I stepped back inside, a paper caught my eye beneath the front door. I bent down and lifted it into the light. An official seal stared back at me. Bold letters stamped across the top, "Notice of guardianship hearing." My fingers shook as I read the date. Barely a month away. The air seemed to vanish from the room. They weren't just after my papers, or my reputation. They were moving to take my very name, to strip me of the right to call myself my own man. Fury and disbelief surged together until words formed in my throat, whispered into the silence. Not yet. Not ever. The notice still lay on my kitchen table that morning, its seal staring back at me like a threat carved in ink. A guardianship hearing. My own blood wanted to strip me of control over my life. The air was brittle with winter cold as I buttoned my jacket and made my way downtown. Each step toward the courthouse felt like a march toward a gallows. The marble halls inside echoed with footsteps and whispers, and when my eyes met Darian's across the corridor, his smirk confirmed what I already knew. This was never about my welfare. Lorraine lingered by his side, her stare sharp as a blade, as if she had already written me off as a man defeated. Inside the courtroom, the weight of their lies filled the air. Darian stood tall, voice practiced, presenting so-called medical statements claiming I was slipping into confusion, unfit to handle my affairs. His words dripped with false concern, but the intent was venom clear to anyone who dared look closer. Lorraine followed, her tone sickly sweet as she painted stories of my paranoia, how I accused neighbors of watching me, how I supposedly frightened clerks in town. Each lie landed like a stone against my chest, but I stayed silent, steadying myself, watching the judge's brow tighten. Silas Drayton stepped forward, his presence steady as he laid out pieces of evidence proving the signatures were forged, the documents tampered with. For a moment, relief stirred inside me, but the evidence was partial, circumstantial, not yet enough to topple the tower of lies my son had built brick by brick. The judge leaned back, eyes weighing the scales, and for the first time, I feared the gavel might come down against me. The room spun with the thought that my own life might be signed away, not by strangers, but by the very blood I once protected. Gideon, loyal to the end, rose and spoke on my behalf. His words were honest, but the rumors already seeded made his voice sound like a lone cry against a storm. The judge's eyes softened but soon turned back toward Darian's documents, and I felt the cold hand of defeat creeping closer. It wasn't just my estate on the line, it was my dignity, my right to stand as a man in my own name. My silence, long held, pressed against my ribs until I thought it might crush me. Then a voice broke through the tension, shaking yet clear. Elara. My granddaughter rose from her seat at the back, her hands trembling as she spoke. She recalled a night weeks ago when she overheard Darian bragging to Lorraine about manipulating papers, boasting how easily he could sway officials. Her words cut through the lies like a blade, and the room stilled. The judge's eyes widened, Darian's face paled, and Lorraine shot a glare that could have burned holes in her skin. But the truth had slipped into the open, fragile yet undeniable. My heart pounded with both fear for Elara and pride that she found the courage to stand where I had been silenced. Chaos erupted. Lorraine hissed, trying to shush Elara, Darian shouting that she was confused, untrustworthy, poisoned by my bitterness. The judge banged the gavel, calling for order, but no one could unhear what had been spoken. For the first time in years, I caught a glimpse of something in Darian's eyes I had never seen. Fear, not mine, but his. The tide was shifting, and though the war was far from over, I knew then that their fortress of lies had begun to crack. The echoes of the gavel were still rattling inside my chest as I closed the heavy oak doors of the courthouse behind me. Hours of listening to my own son and his wife brand me as weak, unfit, and senile had drained something deep within me. By the time I reached the mansion I now called home, night had already settled in. The grand halls felt hollow, the silence pressing on me heavier than the marble floors beneath my feet. Yet beneath that exhaustion stirred something sharper, an unease that told me this fight hadn't ended in the courtroom. It had only changed its battleground. I had just lowered myself into the old leather chair in the library when I caught a flicker of movement through the side window. At first, I thought it was a branch stirred by the wind, but then I saw Lorraine's figure slipping along the hedges outside. She moved with a careful urgency, glancing over her shoulder more than once. Curiosity pried me from the chair, and I followed quietly into the cold night, my steps steady, my breath controlled. The air smelled of damp earth, and the moon's light cast her shadow longer than her frame. I trailed her as she walked down the narrow path toward the side street, and there, half hidden beneath the trees, Gideon Maris stood waiting. I stayed in the shadows as Lorraine's voice carried on the wind. She spoke in that practiced, syrupy tone, the one she always used when trying to bend people to her will. "You've stood by him long enough, Gideon," she whispered. "But loyalty to a sinking ship drags you under. Darian can offer you things Eldrick never could. Comfort, influence, money. All you have to do is step aside." The words struck like cold steel. My neighbor, the one man I had still trusted, was now a target of their venom. Watching her weave her net of lies around him turned my stomach. Yet I held back. To storm forward would risk more than my dignity. It would show them I was still too easily provoked. Gideon didn't answer immediately. His posture was tense, his voice low, almost uncertain. I've known Eldrick a long time. He's never been anything but honest. Lorraine pressed harder, sliding closer to him. Honest doesn't pay the bills. Think carefully. You don't want to be on the wrong side of this. I couldn't bear to hear more. The shame of eavesdropping mingled with the bitter truth. Every man has a price, and betrayal always blooms where weakness is watered. I turned back toward the mansion, my mind heavier than my steps. Whether Gideon resisted or not, the seed of temptation had been planted. Inside, the study's air smelled of old paper and varnished wood. I opened the drawer where I'd kept decades of estate documents, dusty binders filled with statements, contracts, and receipts, perhaps out of instinct, or maybe desperation. I began cross-checking what I had long neglected. My fingers traced the columns of numbers, the faded ink telling a story I hadn't wanted to read. But the truth bled through the ledgers, withdrawals without explanation, investments I had never approved, funds redirected into names I didn't recognize. Darian's fingerprints were all over them. The guardianship hearing, I realized, had only been a smokescreen, while I fought for my dignity. He had been siphoning away what I had built long before. The discovery burned through the fatigue. I leaned back in the chair, the papers trembling slightly in my hands. Rage mingled with clarity. This wasn't about whether I was fit to manage my affairs. It was about Darian covering tracks he'd left years ago. The humiliation at the courthouse, the rumors, the false signatures. They were all weapons in a larger theft, a lifetime of sacrifice, hidden behind layers of deceit. My jaw tightened as I stacked the papers into a neat pile. The time for silence was over. The truth had teeth, and when bared at the right moment, it would bite through every one of their lies. I locked the documents into the safe, the sound of the metal door closing echoing in the quiet study. Just as I turned the key, a faint knock startled me. The sound was soft, urgent, not the kind of knock a stranger would give. I opened the door slowly, and there she was, Elara. Her small frame seemed swallowed by the hallway's shadows. Her hands clenched, her eyes wide with fear. "Grandpa," her voice trembled. "I think they know what you found." The words drained the warmth from the room. My blood ran cold, not from fear for myself, but for her. If she had been watching, if she had been listening, then she was already in their sights, and in her eyes I saw the terror of a truth too dangerous to keep hidden any longer. Alara's voice trembled as she whispered, "They know what you found." The words clung to the cold air in my study like frost. My heart pounded, not from fear for myself, but for her. I guided her gently to sit in the worn leather chair by the fire, its glow faint against the shadow pressing in from the halls. My questions came softly, almost as if I were afraid of her answer. "What exactly did you hear, child?" She hesitated, glancing toward the heavy curtains as though someone lurked just beyond them. Her lips quivered as she finally spoke. "I heard Dad talking to Mom. He said if the court couldn't strip you of the mansion, they'd make sure you didn't last here much longer." A shiver ran through me, though the fire still burned. My own son, my flesh and blood, hadn't just erased me from the family. He was plotting to erase me from life itself. For a long moment, words failed. All I could manage was to place my hand over hers, steadying the trembling that seemed to shake through both of us. The pain wasn't just betrayal. It was heartbreak deeper than any wound a stranger could give. I forced myself to meet her eyes. "Listen to me, Elara. You mustn't repeat this to anyone else, no matter how heavy it weighs on you. Promise me." She nodded, tears welling. My voice grew firmer, though inside I felt as fragile as cracked glass. "Whatever happens, my first duty is to keep you safe. You are not a pawn in their game. Do you understand?" She pressed her lips tight, a child's silent vow, and clutched my sleeve as if to anchor herself. In that moment, I knew this war was no longer about survival. It was about protecting the last innocence left in our fractured bloodline. When she slipped into uneasy sleep on the chair, I turned back to the desk where my scattered papers lay. Something about the quiet seemed unnatural, heavier than usual. My old radio on the shelf hummed faintly, though it was switched off. A strange static leaked from it, uneven and crackling. My instincts sharpened. Slowly, carefully, I searched the room, running my hands along the edges of shelves and behind the desk. And then I found it, small, almost invisible, tucked inside the baseboard near my desk. A microphone. My chest tightened as I held the device in my hand, its tiny red light long dead but unmistakable in purpose. The faint scent of perfume lingered on the cloth it was wrapped in, Lorraine's scent. My stomach turned. It wasn't paranoia. She had been inside my house. My sanctuary had been pierced, turned into a cage where my every word, my every breath, could be stolen. Betrayal took on a new weight. It wasn't distant anymore. It was in the walls, in the air. I crushed the device in my palm until the plastic cracked, the sound louder than it should have been in the suffocating quiet. I swore under my breath that I would never again underestimate how far they would go. I needed to act fast. I gathered the documents, the proof of Darian's theft, the lifeline I had uncovered in my study, and searched for a hiding place no spy would expect. My gaze fell on the old grandfather clock in the corner, its steady tick the one constant companion in my solitude. I pulled open its hollow back and slid the papers deep inside, behind the pendulum. If they wanted my history, they'd have to tear it from the heart of time itself. As I closed it, the clock struck midnight, the chimes echoing like the toll of a warning bell. And then came the sound, the groan of the front gate swinging open, metal grinding against frost. Elara stirred, her eyes wide with dread. Footsteps echoed faintly against the marble hallway, measured and deliberate. My pulse quickened, but my voice remained steady as I whispered, "Stay behind me, Elara. Tonight. The battle begins in my own house." I could see her small figure nodding in the shadows, her courage fragile but present. The mansion I built to shelter my family had now become the stage for their betrayal. The echo of footsteps inside my mansion was heavier than any dream could conjure. Elara stood behind me, her small hands clutching at my sleeve, trembling but silent. The cane in my right hand felt heavier than usual, not just a tool for balance, but the only weapon left to an old man. My other hand lingered on the grandfather clock, where I had hidden the papers that could burn Darian's lies to ash. The house was no longer a shelter. It was a trap filled with shadows. My heart pounded against my ribs as I edged toward the hallway, every creak of the floorboards sounding like a gunshot in the silence. Just as I prepared myself for the worst, the door burst open, and Gideon Maris stumbled in, breathless. His face was pale, his eyes darting like a man who had seen something he wished he hadn't. "They're here. Eldrick," he hissed, his voice a sharp whisper cutting the air. "And your son's not alone." Relief and suspicion tangled inside me. Gideon had stood by me before, but how did he know to come at this exact moment? Trust was a currency I had very little of left. Still, the urgency in his eyes left no room for doubt, at least not tonight. He leaned close, describing what he had seen outside. Darian's car parked brazenly by the edge of my property, shadows shifting near the garden wall as if men circled, waiting for a signal. Alara's grip on my arm tightened until her knuckles whitened. "I saw her," she whispered, her voice thin as glass. Grandma Lorraine. She was at the gate. The thought chilled me more than the winter air seeping through the cracks of the mansion's old windows. Lorraine at the gate meant more than a visit. It meant calculation. We moved carefully toward the veranda, each step measured, the air thick with the smell of damp wood and the sound of distant crickets. Through a narrow crack in the window, we could hear Darian's voice, low but clear, speaking to someone I recognized, a man who had once worked for Gideon. "Help us, and there's a cut for you when the old man falls," Darian promised, his words drenched in arrogance and certainty. My blood surged hot in my veins, the rage so strong it nearly blinded me. It wasn't enough that he tried to erase me from the family. Now he was poisoning loyalty outside it, bribing men to betray from within. Gideon leaned close to me, whispering almost apologetically, "That one. He's always been desperate for money. Darian knew it. He's turning everyone who can be bought. His words were bitter, laced with the shame of knowing one of his own had been swayed. My thoughts grew heavier. Money corroded everything. It could turn friends into enemies, and family into predators. The betrayal stretched beyond blood now, seeping like poison into the very soil beneath my home. I grabbed Gideon's sleeve, pulling him closer so our eyes met in the pale glow from the veranda lights. "Swear to me, Gideon," I said, my voice low but sharper than steel. "Swear you won't let him turn you too." His face twisted with hurt, but he nodded. "On my life. Eldrick, I stand with you." Yet inside, doubt gnawed at me. Alara leaned in, her voice barely audible. "I heard Lorraine earlier. She was plotting, Grandpa. They're working together." That truth clamped down on my heart like a vice. It wasn't paranoia. It was war. Then the garden lights flickered, buzzing before flooding the yard in harsh brightness. The shadows that had hidden them evaporated, and Darian's figure came into view. He stood at the front entrance, tall and rigid, flanked by men whose faces were masked by darkness, but whose presence was unmistakable. His arrogance radiated across the distance. His steps measured like a conqueror approaching spoils. My hand tightened around the cane, every muscle tense. "If it's a war they want," I whispered, my voice steady despite the storm inside me, "it begins tonight." For 5 years, they erased me from their lives. Now they've come to erase me from my own home. The night held its breath long after the garden lights snapped on. Darian stood at the threshold with 2 men at his shoulders, their jackets zipped to the collar against the cold. Lorraine hovered a pace behind, face taut, eyes bright with the kind of confidence that grows in the dark. Alara pressed close to my side, and somewhere in the house the grandfather clock prepared to mark another hour of a very long night. "I'm done with the games," Darian said, stepping forward as if the marble floor already belonged to him. "You're not well, Dad. We can do this the hard way, or the simple way. Sign what you need to sign, and we'll see you're taken care of." The cane felt steady in my fist. The fear that had chased me for years receded, like a tide finally turning. "I won't be stepping back," I said quietly. "Not from my name, not from my home." He smiled the way a young executive smiles when a deal is already closed. "Then don't blame me for where this goes." Lorraine slid in beside him, voice low and cutting. "You've hoarded wealth while playing the martyr. The court almost saw through you. Eldrick, the world will, too. It's time to stop pretending you're the victim here." "I gave you all more than you ever deserved," I answered. The words surprised even me with how calmly they landed. "And you threw it away." Her mouth opened, ready with the next rehearsed line. I didn't give her the chance. "Bring them in," I called over my shoulder. From the side corridor, Gideon appeared, breathless but firm, followed by Silas Drayton, hat in hand, jaw set, a leather folio tucked beneath his arm. The men at Darian's shoulder exchanged glances. The house, a moment ago arranged like a stage for fear, reshaped itself into a room for reckoning. Silas stopped between Darian and me, eyes flicking once to Alara, then to the clock. "Mr. Vaughn," he said, loud enough to carry. "As requested." I nodded. "Open it." He placed the folio on the console table, unfastened the straps, and began to set documents in measured rows. Copies of bank correspondence, timestamps from the post office, a notarized statement from the bank manager who'd questioned the forged power of attorney, certified emails from a fraud examiner who had traced the edits to my signature back to an IP address registered to Darian's company account, a log of calls, numbers, dates, durations, between Lorraine and the notary who had since lost her license. Darian's voice tried for laughable ease and found only air. "This is nonsense." "It's record," Silas replied, unmoved. "And there's more." Gideon stepped forward. He seemed older than he had an hour earlier. Perhaps loyalty ages a man when it's tested in public. "I heard you by the wall," he said to Darian, voice steady. Heard you offering one of my old workers a cut for spying, for helping you push your father into incompetency. I told myself not to believe it even while I listened, but I heard every word. Lorraine's jaw shifted. He's lying. No, Alara said, surprising us all with the force in her tone. He isn't, and you know it. Silence spread, and for the first time in years, I watched certainty drain from my son's face. The triumph he wore like a tailored suit began to fray at the seams. There's something else, I said, turning toward the grandfather clock. The brass pendulum swung like a slow heartbeat. I pulled the panel free and withdrew a sealed envelope, the notary's stamp bright against the flap. 5 years ago, when your mother died and you banned me from my own family, I started writing everything down. I learned to be precise, to be patient. I handed the envelope to Silas, who slid it carefully and laid the contents beside the other papers. This, he announced, tapping the deed with 2 fingers, is the irrevocable trust established 18 months ago. The mansion, the surrounding acreage, the accounts Mr. Vaughn rebuilt in silence, all placed beyond contest under a guardian clause triggered by any attempt to declare him incompetent. The beneficiary, present and named. Alara looked at me, eyes wide, breath caught halfway between hope and fright. Your granddaughter, Silas said to Darian, his tone matter-of-fact, almost kind. Not you. Lorraine's composure snapped. You manipulated a child against her parents. Don't call her a child, I replied. She's the only one among you who remembered what family meant when there was nothing to gain. Darian lunged a step, finger stabbing the air. You think you can hide behind papers? Behind tricks? We are your blood. You banned me from family, I said, feeling the truth settle into place like the final stone of a foundation. But you were the ones who left family behind. The room held its breath again. Outside, the first gray seam of morning opened along the ridgeline, and the frost on the lawn took on a faint, fragile shine. One of the men at Darian's shoulder shifted back, unwilling to keep standing in a fight that had changed shape. The other stared at the documents as if they might burn him. Gideon moved to Alara's side, a protective presence without needing to be asked. Silas gathered the copies, sliding them into separate envelopes as if distributing verdicts. These are filed, he said. County clerk, bank compliance, bar association. Even if you walk out with the originals, the record stands. Attempts to interfere now only add to the case. Lorraine's voice thinned. We could still. You could, I said. And you would wake every morning to find the truth waiting at your door. She turned to Darian, searching his face for the old momentum, the old swagger. It wasn't there. What remained was a naked, bewildered anger. The kind that looks around for a cliff to push and finds only ground that will not move. He backed toward the doorway, shoulders lifting and falling, then lashed out at the air in front of him. Keep the house, he spat. Keep your stories. One day you'll be alone in these rooms, and none of this will matter. I let the words pass like weather. One day, I agreed, but not this day. They left in pieces, Lorraine first, arms wrapped around herself as if shielding from a wind only she could feel. Darian last, pausing at the threshold to look back at me with a hatred that had the ache of grief embedded in it. Then the door shut, and the lights he had triggered in my garden blinked out, one by one, as dawn took over their work. We stood for a long time without speaking. The house exhaled. Ilara's hand slid into mine, small and warm. In the quiet, I heard the day begin, a bird testing the morning, a truck somewhere on the road, the pendulum of the clock keeping ordinary time like a pledge. Grandpa, Alara whispered, what happens now? Now, I said, guiding her to the table where Silas had arranged the future in neat stacks. We keep what matters safe. The trust stands. The estate is yours when I'm gone, but not just the walls and acreage, the rules, the reasons. I looked at Gideon, then back to Alara. Family is not secured by entitlement. It is built by gratitude, respect, and love. If any of those are missing, the roof will fall no matter how strong the beams. Tears welled in her eyes, and she nodded with a seriousness that did not belong to childhood. Silas squeezed my shoulder, promised to return in the afternoon with final confirmations, and slipped out. Gideon lingered, his loyalty quiet, then left us to the gentler work that follows any storm, making coffee, opening drapes, straightening pictures. I walked the hall slowly, Kane tapping a soft metronome on the oak. Marjorie's photo waited by the window, the one where the light on her face always felt like morning. They thought wealth was my strength, I told her, as the sun eased over the blue ridge and washed the frost to silver. But it was love all along. The house felt different then, not bigger, not smaller, but right-sized to a truth I could carry. Papers would be argued, perhaps, and rumors would flare again. But the foundation had been set in the only place that mattered. Legacy is not a prize handed to the loudest hands. It is a trust placed with the faithful. I had lost a son to the narrow rooms of his own ambition. I had been cut from photographs, turned into a rumor, pressed to the edge of my name. And yet the line had held, thin as it was, held by a girl who remembered the sound of an old man's laugh and the steadiness of a promise made at a kitchen table. I turned back toward the living room where Alara waited, where the morning had already begun to soften the edges of a brutal night. The cane felt lighter, the air felt clean. I lost my son, but I found my legacy in the courage of a granddaughter who still believed in me.